and welcome to Common Voices, a podcast focused on shining a light on the incredible individuals and allies who are fighting hatred and anti-Semitism from across Canada. Today we have with us Mr. Warren Kinsella, a Canadian lawyer, author, political consultant, and commentator. Warren has worked as a reporter, served as a chief of staff to a federal minister, and helped found the Toronto-based consulting firm Daisy Group, specializing in political strategy and communications and crisis management. He's also the author of multiple books, and today writes opinion columns and maintains a Substack and blog, and appears in a lot of media commentary. Is a very prominent voice on issues of politics, extremism, and anti-Semitism here in Canada. Warren, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Obviously, in the Jewish community, there have been a few allies as vocal as you. You have truly shown up. You have not shied away from making any public statements. And I wonder if other people in the community know for actually just how long you've been an ally and an advocate. You know, for example, I found you wrote a book in 1994. Web of Hate, which was exposing neo-Nazism in Canada.
Yeah,
31 years ago.
I've got it here somewhere.
Sorry, oh, do you?
Yeah, I've got a copy of it here somewhere. It's over there. Here, I'll go grab it and show you the cover.
Please.
Hold on a minute.
There.
And so it was a national bestseller. There's been multiple editions of it, and regrettably, there was a need for it because the neo-Nazis, white supremacist movement had become very dominant in Canada in the 90s. How I came into the subject, my past, I don't know how respectable I look right now, but I started in the punk rock scene when I was a teenager in Calgary, and I had my own band, my own record label, and was involved in the punk scene, and it was fun. We had poets and artists and musicians, and it was fun. And one night we got the opportunity, my band, to open for a well-known British band called 999 at the University of Calgary. And so we were pretty excited. So we opened for them, and then we got down into the crowd because in the punk scene, we're not supposed to be a division between the fan and the bands. And we were enjoying ourselves. And one of my friends tapped me on the shoulder and said, "There's some guys over there making Nazi salutes." And I said to him, "That's impossible." And up to that point, any of us teenagers in Calgary, we'd experienced the Holocaust and Nazism in the pages of our social sciences and history textbooks, not in real life. And so I went through the crowd and went over, and sure enough, there were three big guys there, shaved heads, suspenders, t-shirts, jeans, Doc Marten boots with colored laces.
Yeah.
And one of them was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Drown the boat people." And at that point in Canadian history, Canada was bringing in refugees from the former Cambodia, who were called the boat people. And these guys were, in fact, making Nazi salutes. So I told the guy in the t-shirt, "Stop what you're doing." He said, "F off, you effing Jew." I told him again. He said the same thing. I said, "I'm not Jewish, I'm Irish, and I'm Catholic, and you should really stop." And he took a swing at me, and so a big fight erupted. And so we beat them, my friends and I, and they disappeared nursing their wounds, and we went back to enjoying the show. And after the show, we came out through the doors at Mac Hall at the University of Calgary, and the skinheads were still there. They were sitting on the stairs just outside the door, nursing their wounds. And the one in the t-shirt pointed at me, and he said, "We'll be back. We'll be back." And in the intervening years, as a citizen, as a lawyer, as a writer, I found that they've never really gone away. The black tide of anti-Semitism ebbs and flows. It rises and suppresses according to economic events, political events, and so on. But what was extraordinary to me as somebody who had been writing about it, tracking it for so many years, is, October 7th was an important event in human history, not just in Jewish history. And this terrible pogrom against citizens, against innocent men, women, children, and babies. And, that was precisely the day, precisely the moment when the world should have been sympathetic to the obvious victim, which was the Jewish people, the Israeli people. And instead, it flipped on its head.
Yes.
And before, even Daniel, even before, as you would know, even before Israel went into Gaza militarily 3 weeks later, there were 2,500 protests around the world using identical signage, using the same language, using the same talking points around the world. And my background is politics. I've worked for Jean Chrétien and helped run his campaigns. And the one thing I've learned is how to spot a campaign. This was a campaign.
Absolutely.
It had organization, it had money, it had messaging, it had a strategy. And unfortunately, in the intervening 2 years, it's been a winning strategy for them. It's been a winning campaign of propaganda and hatred against the Jewish people, against Israel, and against the West.
I couldn't agree with you more, obviously. And, as someone who works in the campus space, it was incredibly obvious to me. I attended and visited 5 or 6 different encampments from across Canada, at UBC, at McGill, at U of T. And the similarities, not just between the actual tents themselves that seem to be the exact identical make, but the literature that was being distributed and the resources and flyers in support of the Communist Party of Canada, right? It was very interesting to me when you saw reporters and then writing stories about these encampments, because you'd think that would be pertinent, that all of these materials promoting the Communist Party of Canada, right? It was very political in that sense, right? And considering how few students were actually at these encampments, U of T, for example, they didn't have more than 100 individuals, right, at that encampment. There's 96,000 students enrolled at U of T.
Mm-hmm.
So if the media sees 100 people, who knows what percentage of them are students? And then furthermore, all of this content supporting Marxism and communism, you don't think that would warrant a mention in any of your articles, about this pattern you're seeing at these encampments? But
Yeah,
unfortunately, I did not see
and
it.
and that is the job of journalists. And I have taught journalism at the University of Calgary, at Carleton University. I've taught journalism. The number one prerequisite, the job requirement in journalism, is curiosity and finding out the truth.
That's right.
So, getting back to that first example I gave you, those skinheads wearing Doc Marten boots with multicolored laces, there is a specific meaning for that, right? If they wear white laces, it means they are a neo-Nazi. And so that's what I found out subsequently and wrote about it. Or 88, HH, Heil Hitler, or the 14 Words, which was devised by David Lane, a member of the order, the Bruder Schweigen, who killed Alan Berg in Colorado in 1984. All of these things have meaning. And what's extraordinary, and it's great that you raised U of T. I was there as well. So for our documentary called The Campaign, which has come out of the book, I was there with the film crew, basically as we were getting started. And I decided, so the kids were there. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4". So nobody messes with me generally. So I was escorting the camera crew around, and these kids, wearing their keffiyehs, covering their faces, are following me. And, I'd point out the red triangle. I'd say, you see that? The red triangle was devised by Hamas during this conflict to superimpose on targets of the IDF or average Jews. It is a promise of murder. That's what the red triangle means. Or, intifada. It doesn't just mean just this benign shaking off. The intifada, the first and second intifada, were campaigns of murder against Israelis and Jews. Like in the second intifada, more Jews were killed than on October 7th. And so I went around with the camera crew pointing out what these different things mean. The obligation of journalists to be curious and find out and explain to their readers and their viewers and their listeners what these things mean. And these kids were following me around, and I could tell, Daniel, they didn't know.
I'm sure they didn't.
They didn't know. They, to them, from the river to the sea is this, well, that sounds nice. It's general. It's like, no, boys and girls, like it has a really specific meaning. The sea is the Mediterranean, the river's the Jordan. That's Israel. It means wiping out Israel. And intifada has an ominous and murderous implication to it. And so at the outset, this campaign, this propaganda campaign, they were very sophisticated in their use of language. So they'd use symbols like the red triangle or the red hand. The red hand comes from the Second Intifada. So that horrible photo of the now departed terrorist leaning out the window with blood on his
The one, where they're wearing at the Academy Awards and everything.
Wearing it at the Academy Awards.
Yeah.
Like all these famous movie stars, they're idiots.
Yeah.
They're fools. It's like you're celebrating murder. So, the stupid people are going to be stupid. But journalists, to your point, have an obligation
Absolutely
to tell the truth to their readers, their viewers, their listeners. And that has been one of the characteristics of the past 2 years, is that has not happened.
No, it really has not. Not whatsoever. And I'm sure you would agree, it's not even in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in the context of the war. It's journalism, unfortunately, has become so incredibly partisan that you read an article in any media outlet today and you question it. You no longer accept it as fact. You no longer accept what you were reading in front of you. And I can remember a time in the 90s and in the early 2000s where that certainly was not the case, right? And that's something I do think a lot of people want to come back to that. I'm hopeful with Barry Weiss now serving as the editor-in-chief of CBS and with the Free Press, I think being a very centered news outlet, and there being a lot of demand for that. And here's hoping. I want to ask you as an investigative journalist, because I find this very interesting. I remember in the 90s very well the Heritage Front and Kijkstra and Zundel, and the horrific work that they did. And you're 100% correct. And neo-Nazism was a despicable and strong movement in the 90s. What parallels do you see between the anti-Semitism you documented then in the 90s, between that anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism you see today, post October 7th, coming from overwhelmingly the anti-Israel movement, but now, as I'm sure you've seen, it's also seen a reawakening on the right, thanks to individuals like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, and if you want to say Kanye West.
Yeah, no, there unfortunately is many figures. Well, two things: methodology and content. So, in terms of methodology, if you take a look at Zundel and Kijkstra and all of these Holocaust deniers in the late 70s and the early 80s, and I've interviewed them all, and they were the earliest adopters, along with Al Qaeda, of the internet. They had web presence that was more sophisticated and more glossy than that which many governments had at that time. They were the first to recognize the potential that it would give them for spreading their homilies of hate around the world. Like previously, if they wanted to, like the Heritage Front wanted to get their message out, they'd have to print out pamphlets, and then they'd have to send somebody out to New Brunswick and risk arrest, and it was ineffective. That was the only way they could get their message out. With the arrival of the internet, they could do it anonymously, instantaneously, and globally at no cost.
Yeah.
So, like in my case, how I experienced their expertise was I was a witness in support of Deborah Lipstadt in the libel action that she had between herself and David Irving.
Wow.
She had correctly called him a Holocaust denier, and of course he was. And she asked me to be a witness in her trial. I wasn't needed in the end, but because I was on the witness list, Zundel and Irving and all these other assholes were attacking me all the time. And I said to a friend, what should I do? And he said, well, you should start your own website, which I did, warrenkinsella.com. And it worked. Pushing back as a citizen is one of the things I'd encourage all your readers. And I know your organization believes this.
Absolutely.
Don't just take it, push back. Like my little website, my little presence started off to oppose Irving and Zundel.
Wow.
And sometimes some years I get 6 million visitors.
Wow.
So it works if you stick to it and you stick to the message. So which raises the second point, the message. The thread that runs from Keegstra and Zundel, their job was to whitewash the sins of the Nazis and rehabilitate the reputation of Hitler, um, is almost identical to that of the jihadists. It's denial. So in their case, their objective was to deny the mass murder that was the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews and millions of others who were killed by the Nazis. These guys, the new haters, do the same thing. But they're much more adept at the internet than any such group has ever been. Like, on the while October 7th was underway, right? When Hamas was still in the police station at Sadara, still active, these guys were on the internet across Western democracy, pushing out denials of the rapes and the sexual violence, pushing out denials of the atrocities, and propagating really successfully false messaging about what had taken place that day. And it worked. It worked. And the thing that I found so frustrating is that, Israel is the most technologically advanced nation in the world, in my opinion. But Israel really sucks at getting its own story out. And that's why it's important for, non-Jews, people like me, to help out, because, the other side has been winning. We need to push back at their false narrative, against their propaganda, because frankly, until the ceasefire, they'd really been dominating the discourse.
And so that's an interesting note. You say until the ceasefire. Would you say that since the ceasefire, they haven't been dominating the discourse in the same way, or has there been more opportunity to point out how ridiculous they are since they haven't commented on Hamas massacring Palestinians on the daily?
I gave a speech about this last night. The mask slipped. Before the ceasefire, and I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but I give him credit for helping to pioneer it. Before the ceasefire, they were very successful at propagating the false notion that they loved Palestinians, they didn't hate Israelis. You and I know they didn't love Palestinians, they hated Israelis. And their preoccupation was wiping out Israel, not in creating
And
Palestine.
destroying our existence. You can't be an Israeli musician writing instrumental folk songs.
And they were really good at that, across sectors, with unions, with governments, with NGOs, with academia, and particularly, unfortunately, within Gen Z and millennials. The reason why I say the ceasefire was so important is the mask dropped. The people who had been demanding a ceasefire for 2 years, suddenly, well, you had a ceasefire. It's not a perfect ceasefire, but it's a ceasefire. What did they do? They kept protesting against Israel.
Right.
What did they do when it was documented by Hamas itself that Hamas was engaged in actual atrocities against innocent Palestinians? The thing that Israel had been falsely accused of for 2 years. Well, here it was Hamas promoting the fact that they were doing that. Nothing, not a word, not a peep from these people. So that's why I say the mask slipped. There, we saw and were able to show the world, and we need to tell this story, all of us, is look, their preoccupation wasn't Palestine. It was not loving Palestine, it was hating Israel. Mm-hmm. And their preoccupation wasn't Israeli atrocities. It was being indifferent to the atrocities of Hamas against innocent Palestinians. So that's why right now we're in a very important time where we have an opportunity to show people of good faith, take a look at what's happening. What's happening is it clearly, these are, if it's like the Wizard of Oz analogy I use, it's pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, the evil Wizard of Oz. Now we see who they really are. And it's an obligation on all of us, guys like you and me, to make sure people know about it.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your messaging, and especially mentioning something like people of good faith, right? Because overwhelmingly, and with our organization and the work that we do, that's definitely the audience, right? We're not telling our students or stakeholders go out and find the haters and get into arguments and wars with them. It's not going to change anything most of the time. And I'd much rather for our students on campus, especially that you engage in meaningful conversation and meaningful dialogue, and especially try to find your common ground as Canadians, because I think, as you mentioned earlier, what we've been seeing in this phenomenon and this movement in Canada, but around the world, is really not one that is exclusively anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, but it's one that is anti-Western. It's one that is anti-common sense. It's one that is anti-common values. And I wonder, obviously, in the Jewish community, we call you an ally. But I don't think it's only standing up for the Jewish people that motivates you. I think it's standing up, as we said, for those Western values, for that common sense, for that morality, right? That is so important to you, if you would agree. How can we then inspire other journalists, other Canadians, other individuals to recognize that what we are seeing and experiencing today is not simply an attack on Jewish Canadians or on Judeo-Christian values, but on an attack on our very way of life here in Canada? Because it seems many individuals are cognizant of that, but still the majority don't seem to be.
My background is politics, so I help run campaigns, or I run campaigns, and I've been doing that for many years. And in politics, one of the things you have to do, guys like me, is find out what are the drivers, as they're called, for public opinion. What is motivating people in a certain way? What is preventing them from going in another direction? And, in the case of this explosion of anti-Semitism that's taking place over the past 2 years, because it is something that is unprecedented in the past 80, 90 years, right? Since the Second World War. ADL, for example, has done excellent research polling for 60 years, showing that people's objection to racism and anti-Semitism ran in parallel.
Yes.
If you were concerned about racism, you were concerned about anti-Semitism as well. About 5 or 6 years ago, the preoccupation, the objection to anti-Semitism among young people in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, started to move away. And so the bad guys with this very sophisticated online campaign stepped into that void. For example, they were assisted by the pandemic, at a point where young people couldn't have convocations, they couldn't have grad ceremonies, they couldn't get together in person. They had to go to this kind of miserable online world. Well, guess who was waiting there for them, propagating conspiracy theories and so on? It was Iran and Qatar and Hamas and Hezbollah and all of these bad guys. And what they did very successfully to promote anti-Semitism around the world is say, and you and I have been to Israel, and we know this is false, but say that Israel is a white supremacist, fascist, apartheid state like South Africa. And if you come out with us to our protest, you're not being anti-Semitic, you're opposing racism.
Right.
Now, of course, when you go to Israel, you see black kids in the IDF and brown kids in the IDF and women in positions of authority. It's a diverse, pluralistic society.
Yeah.
But these guys have been really good at promoting this notion that Israel is the new South Africa. That's number one. In terms of where the anti-democracy, anti-Western stuff is coming from, because you're quite right. If you go to any protest now, and they take place weekly across North America and Europe, is you'll see these pro-Hamas people coming together in a very cooperative fashion with Marxists and Marxist-Leninists and extremists on the left. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? Partly it's the swing in politics in the West. I can tell you, the other thing I learned from politics, it is a pendulum. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. Yeah. So if you have politics moving to the right in the form of Donald Trump and various populist leaders, inevitably you have situations like in New York City where you have this far left anti-Semitic mayor as the embodiment of the opposition to this. Mm-hmm. And so this is why these two disparate groups have come together, because they recognize that they have shared objectives. And it's predictable if you're familiar with politics and how campaigns work. And So for the time being, we're up against a formidable enemy, an extremist far left and an extremist pro-Hamas anti-Semitic group that has significant numbers.
Yes, unfortunately, and we're seeing it now on the extremist far right as well. And I'd hate to be Jewish in America nowadays because I feel more and more of them are feeling politically homeless. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's something I used to say because I've been in the community 15 years now, and I've worked at B'nai B'rith and Federation and all over the place. And I would always say, as an expert on anti-Semitism, especially in Canada, anti-Semitism on the right wasn't a problem here in the sense that it wasn't targeting and attacking Jewish students and young Jewish Canadians the way that anti-Semitism on the radical left has, right? And especially on campus, right? The majority of anti-Semitism Jewish students experience today is anti-Zionism, is through the lens of anti-Israel discrimination. And meanwhile, on the right, there was no legitimacy to Heil Hitler's. There was no legitimacy to the Haken Crews and to Nazi epithets and slogans. Right? It existed on the dark web. There was nobody took it seriously. But over the last 5 years in the States, with the rise of individuals like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and the Hodge twins, and more and more and more, of these right-leaning figures now who are bringing back and resurrecting that classic anti-Semitism, you're really seeing it from both sides. And unfortunately, the media doesn't have the influence that it has today,
No.
comparatively, to several decades ago. So you're seeing these podcasters, right, and these influencers who have no experience and no clue. And we all saw that infamous Douglas Murray, Dave Smith conversation, where he
Mm-hmm.
said, "Haven't you been?" So you had just mentioned you were in Israel, I believe it was a few months ago.
Yeah, I was there in May. Yeah, shooting the documentary.
Yes, so many Canadian journalists, I'm sure you would agree, have not got the story right as to what's happening in Israel, especially the CBC, I think, has published so many erroneous articles. For someone who was recently there and for saw and as a journalist who saw it with your own two eyes, what is the media missing here in Canada? What can we do to correct them on this record? What do we need to show them? Is there anything less of them doing what you did and coming to Israel that'll make that change?
There'd be a number of things, but the principal one is, Israel, as I indicated, and I've been to Israel a few times, is a diverse, pluralistic, democratic society surrounded by a sea of tyranny and oppression. And it has a wonderful story to tell. It's unfortunate that Netanyahu has never had an English speaking foreign minister. You can check on that. He hasn't. That's why he's always on the news
Right.
and in the Western world. And that's a mistake, in my opinion, as somebody advises politicians. After a certain point, they kind of get sick of your face. And Netanyahu is very unpopular in the West. I would have other people representing
I agree
Israel,
with
like
you.
Elam Levy or what have you.
Yeah.
But the main answer to your question is Israel. The answer to every question is Israel. When you go there, you see that it is diverse, it is secular, it is modern, it is cultural. There's so many amazing things going on in Israel, and it tells its own story. But unfortunately, because of the economics of news gathering these days, right now, there's not a single Canadian news organization that has a bureau in Israel, not one. And so the only time that North American journalists gather there is at a time when there's conflict.
Yeah.
And this particular conflict, obviously, neither Hamas nor Israel was allowing anybody to go into the battle zone for obvious reasons. But Hamas was smart. During the Persian Gulf War, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, General Schwarzkopf would come out every morning and say, here's what happened in the war yesterday. Here's what our objective was. Here was our relative degree of success. Here's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. They were open about their objectives. Israel does not do that. Whereas Hamas deputized young women who had Instagram accounts that, metastasized from 5,000 followers to 5 million. And so Western news organizations are getting clips and getting information from Hamas news sources.
Yeah.
And, the news business, it's filling a hole, as we call it. What's the hole on the news page? Hamas recognized very early on that there was a necessity to fill the hole, and they've been doing that. They've been offering content in a situation where Israel has been very quiet. And it's a mistake, because I think Israel has a great story to tell. It needs to just tell its story better.
It's a very, very valid point. I appreciate that, and I hope the Israel's Foreign Affairs Ministry is listening to this podcast right now. Um, Something I've really appreciated and respected about you, and continue to respect, obviously, about you, and something I see is, there's a lot of people nowadays on social media who are very partisan. I'd say the majority of people are very partisan. And when it comes to their criticisms, right, they're only leveling their critiques on one side. So it's essentially today on social media and in the media, essentially you've picked a side, you're going to level all your critiques against the other side. But there are some individuals who still continue to be centrist and objective in that way. People like in the States, Bill Maher, I think is very refreshing because he's constantly critiquing both the left and the right. And I think in Canada, you're kind of like the Canadian Bill Maher in that way. I don't know if anyone's ever made that comparison, because I see you constantly critiquing individuals on both the left and the right, and policies on both the left
Mhm.
and the right. How what's been the reception to that? As someone who is trying to be, balanced and objective, how have you been able to maintain, your credibility across, both the liberals and the conservatives, especially when you're engaging in this high stakes topic of anti-Semitism?
It's well, I guess the way I look at it is, if I have a morning where somebody's calling me a Nazi and somebody's calling me a communist, that's a good day. You know, if you're in the middle of public opinion, that's where the biggest audience is. And it happens to be where I am. There are some things in which I have a conservative point of view, let's say on fiscal issues, and I have a progressive point of view on social issues. And that really is aligned with what most people are like in Western democracy. The thing that I've found most disappointing in the past 2 years, it happened to me last night. I was with Matthew Taub with Unapologetically Jewish last night. He was showing the October 7th film. And before and after the film, I had people coming up to me in the Jewish community saying what they always say, like you did when we met. Thank you. And I'm grateful. I'm honored by that. But it makes me sad
Yeah,
that what I'm doing is unusual.
yeah,
It shouldn't be unusual.
yeah.
Everybody should be doing this. I'm not a hero. I'm not remarkable. I'm just saying what is obviously the truth. The Jewish people are the victims of history, and in particular have been the victims over the past 2 years from fire bombings of synagogues, shooting up of schools, murders in Washington and Boulder and Minneapolis and around the world. Our Jewish brothers and sisters deserve our support. And what I'm doing is not remarkable at all. It's not motivated by any ideology. It's how my parents brought me up and my brothers. It's just what you do. And if you encounter a Nazi, skinhead making a Nazi salute at a show, you go up to him and say, "Stop, stop."
That's right.
That's what you do.
That's right.
And what I've found so sad since October 7th is how few people are doing that, and how many people have been scared away. This campaign has been very successful at intimidating people, including Muslims. I'm sure,
Yes.
like you and I both hear from Muslims
Yep.
who will
Absolutely.
say, "I am appalled by the reputation these monsters are giving my religion." And
That's
then
right.
I'll say to them, as I'm sure you have, "Then why don't you speak up?" And they say, "You don't understand. They'll hurt me. They'll kill me and my family." So, they've done a really good job at silencing people of good faith, good intent. And that's something we have to change as well.
Absolutely, Warren. And I think that's a truth that most people don't want to acknowledge. Even as it pertains to Gaza, when people look at surveys and statistics and polling in Gaza, it's very hard to look at that as credible when you know that people are afraid to share their truth, when people cannot dissent, right, for fear of the tyrannical, murderous organization that rules the land. How can you ever dissent? And share your critiques, especially now as you're seeing them, those who have dissented being murdered on the street, executed really, in front of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. It's it's truly horrifying, and I think most Canadians are against this, but there simply is, to your point, not being vocal about it and hoping it'll just kind of, blow over and we'll go back to normal. And it's sad that this has now been years, that people are continuing to look down on the floor essentially and allow this to continue to take place the way that it has, right? As an Israeli Canadian, what I've recognized and what I've faced here in Toronto, it's not that you should support me or you shouldn't support me. It's that you cannot erase me, that you cannot
Yeah.
cancel me, right? I have no problem with Palestinians, Muslims, or anybody living here in Toronto, as long as you recognize the reason we come to Canada. I am an immigrant. My parents are immigrants. You are immigrants. We came here to coexist peacefully. That is the deal we make. That is the contract we sign when we move
Hmm.
to this country, right? We are not allowed to say, as they say in their rallying cry, Zionists off campus. This is the rallying cry of the anti-Israel student clubs, right?
Hmm.
That is anti-Canadian, and I
Hmm.
believe the majority of Canadians would support me on this, but unfortunately are not vocal on this. And I can tell you, I would never encourage our students who we work with, Jewish and non-Jewish, to do the same, right? To say Palestinians off campus, because we don't believe in that. We don't believe Palestinians off campus. We believe in Canada. We must be able to coexist respectfully and peacefully because that's what Canada demands of us, right?
Hmm.
And that's unfortunately, not what we're seeing. I want to ask you because I know, and anyone who follows your Substack knows that you've been working on this book, and that you have this new book coming up. I don't know. I believe you finished it now. Yes.
It's finished. It's edited. It's ready to go, and
That's
we can reveal on your show for the first time next week, the third week of October, or towards the end of October. The people are going to be able to pre-order it online, so at Indigo and Amazon and all the usual places, you'll be able to pre-order the book. The ebook will be out first, I believe, in February. The paper version, hopefully shortly thereafter. There'll be an audiobook, and it's going to be published in Canada and the United States and around the world. And then the documentary called The Campaign will be out around the same time. And we're now speaking with various festivals, Berlin and Tribeca and so on, about getting it shown in those places.
amazing.
So in the spring of next year, I warn everybody, you're going to be seeing too much of Warren Kinsella in different places. But if you're motivated to pick up the book or watch the documentary, I'd be grateful.
Thank you, Warren. We look forward to seeing more of you. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the book, or the documentary? And do they go hand in hand? Are they complementary?
They are complementary, and they're a lot like your mission statement. They're a lot like the mission statement of your organization, as you indicated a minute ago. Like in the book and in the documentary, I interview Palestinians, I interview Muslims, I talk to experts. I don't care what their faith is, and I don't try and litigate the war. I'm not a military expert. Other people can do that much more successfully than me. What I talk about is this propaganda campaign against Israel and Western democracy, and who's behind it. Why have they been successful? What are the messages they've used? What is the strategy they've used? So basically, I take my experience as a political strategist working on campaigns in Canada and the United States and in Israel, and juxtapose that on what I've seen happening since October 7th, and talk about why their campaign is working, but also how we can defeat it, because it's imperative that we defeat it.
Amen, amen, amen. Warren, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time and for being here with us today.
Thanks, my friend.